Good morning, everyone. The song that we just heard is so beautiful that I thought I would read the translation, and it's very, very appropriate. Swamiji will be honored on our 4th of July, his celebration, and the talk today will feature Swamiji quite a bit also. This was written by Swamiji's brother disciple, Swami Swahananda, about Thakur's vision, how Swamiji came into the world. So I'll read the translation. A shaft of condensed light pierces the tranquil ocean of consciousness. A glorious form, forged out of 1,000,000 suns, rises. Maya spell divides the infinite ocean. Who can fathom this play? Disguised as a luminous child, he enters the realm of the infinite, meaning Sri Ramakrishna. And who is it that he embraces in his tender arms? Open your eyes, my hero, says he. Quit meditating, come with me. Ignorance, lust, and greed are drowning the world. At the child's soft touch, the yogi opens his eyes. His heart brims with love. Tears stream down his face. He walks down the starlit path of the Milky Way and in an instant touches the earth. Narayana, in human form, arrives again in this sacred land. Very beautiful. Swami Swahananda did not write many songs. I don't know how many. This is a couple, but this is really very beautiful. So we're continuing this morning with reflections on the Mundaka Upanishad. Last session, we focused on one verse, if you remember, that Natatra Soyabhati, very famous verse, there the sun shines not, nor the moon, nor the stars. We'll also focus today mostly on another very famous verse. Most of you will know this, the verse about the two birds on the same tree. And the interesting thing is that this is actually a verse that's either borrowed or quoted, we can say. It belongs to it's a Rig Vedic verse. And the Upanishads do this sometimes. My feeling is that it's not any type of plagiarism, that they're stealing it from something else, but people were knowledgeable in those days. They would recognize this as an earlier verse. And then the verse after this is the Upanishad's explanation of this verse, and then there's a third verse which follows up with that. So we'll focus mainly on this one verse and this whole idea of the two birds on the same tree. This is also found in Shvetashvatara Upanishad. The first is Rig Veda 1:164. And this is why, if you ever wondered, Dwa Suparna, that why not Dwao Suparno? This is an old Vedic type of grammar of the dual ending. So those who would hear that, they would instantly think, oh, this is some very old type of verse. Now, Swamiji was very, very fond of this particular verse, this Vedic mantra and Upanishadic verse, and he spoke about it on several different occasions, and he turned it into an entire parable. So what Swamiji says is really his interpretation and expansion of this one verse. It's not restricted to what we find here. In fact, when we read this verse, it'll sound very dualistic to us. That the lower bird will be the individual soul, the upper bird will be Ishvara, will be God dwelling there and looking up and just having that vision. It'll sound very dualistic, but the interpretation that we get will show that it can also be explained in a very non-dualistic way, which also Shankaracharya does. And when we see the whole parable that Swamiji turns this into, we see how beautiful an explanation this is. This play between two and one, this play between the lower self and the higher self, the Jivatman, Paramatman, and this ultimate experience of oneness or transcending one and two. This is part of what spiritual life is all about. really how we transcend this initial feeling of separation and awe. Because if there's some distance, we can have the small wave in the huge ocean. We'll be in awe of the ocean, have tremendous reverence for the ocean. And then one day it'll realize that it's one with the ocean, it'll lose its name and form and really just be what it always was, part of the ocean. So we find that in these verses, and then in Swamiji's explanation and commentary, and as I say, parable. He turns it into a whole parable. So last session, we saw this idea of reflection, that the individual soul is like the sun reflected in a container filled with water, so that the sun is real, the individual soul is real, but as a reflection, and it traces back to the real sun. The sun is the only ultimate reality. Here we'll get another view, Swamiji's view of the jiva, which is also a type of reflection, but will have less of an individual reality even. That it'll almost be like seeing ourselves in a mirror and thinking we're somebody else. So anyhow, we'll get to all of these things. So this play between the dualists and the non-dualists. And my feeling is that the Upanishads weren't interested in establishing any one particular doctrine or metaphysical position. That I always say should be read as poetry. And we just get a sense, again, of this play of two in one. That feeling of separation and awe, God dwelling within the heart, and then at other times that feeling of oneness and feeling that we can merge in that reality, and we are that reality, one with that reality. So we'll find that for the Advaitins, that they like to speak about two different points of view. That some texts can be interpreted from this ordinary point of view. That ordinary point of view means we accept the reality of this physical body and the mind and the senses, and I'm an individual, I dwell within, the indweller. We have a Harika point of view. The other is from the highest point of view, and if we want to be perfectly honest, there's no such thing as an absolute point of view. There's this what we call this highest point of view is just from the point of view of the philosopher, but in reality, there's no such thing as a point of view from the absolute. In the absolute, there's no separation. There's no one to have a point of view of anything. So we get two nice illustrations of this. One, when Sri Ramakrishna talks about the salt dal, that the salt dal is trying to find the depths of the ocean. Now the salt dal will have a point of view at every stage. And now I'm going deeper, but when it gets to the bottom, it melts, it becomes one. Then there's no one to have any point of view there. Or he talks about the reflected suns in the different containers. There's a nice conversation with Girish Ghosh. We find towards the end of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna that he says, suppose you have 10 containers filled with water, and the sun is up above, and you see the reflected sun in each container. How many suns are there? So he says there are 11. The 10 reflected suns and the one real sun. So Sri Ramakrishna says, very good. Suppose we break one by one, and then there's only one left. How many suns are there? He says there are two. The one reflected sun and the real sun. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, suppose we break this last container. How many suns are left? And Giri says that only the one real sun is left. Now, sounds like a good answer. And Thakur says, no, there's no one to say what exists then. He who could have said it was the last container that got broken. Then what is. So there's no real point of view that we can take. We talk about this the absolute point of view. It's beyond mind and speech. And it's just that state of oneness. It's an experience. It's not really a we can talk about it as a philosophical position. So when we do, then we're saying from the highest point of view, something like that. But really, this ultimate point of view for Sri Ramakrishna was always experience, and everything else was just a spiritual attitude or from a certain point of view, from taking a doctrine to use to help us to get to the roof. It was never the ultimate truth. It was always a vehicle. This idea of this mott pot, that each and every philosophical position is just a path to get to that highest truth, which is beyond all of this. Okay, so anyhow, I want to get to this verse. I'll read the first two. The first is the actual Rig Vedic verse, and then the second is the kind of Upanishadic explanation of it. Dva suparna sayuja sakaya samanam variksham parijashvajate tayor anya pippalam swadu atti anashnan anyo abhichakashiti. So this is Rig Veda. Samane vrikshe purusho nimagnaha anishaya shochidi muhyamanaha jushtam yada pashyati anyam isham. The other one is the Lord. Asya mahimanam iti vita shokaha. So, two birds of beautiful plumage, the Suparna, beautiful plumage, who are ever connected, Sayuja, who go by the same, then this other Sakaya, it can be interpreted two ways. It's like a Sakya is his friend, or Sakaya. They share the same name. So either go by the same name or inseparable friends, cling to the same tree. Of these, one eats the savory fruits, and then our interpretation is some bitter and some sweet. It doesn't even say that much. Just eat some savory fruits, while the other looks on without eating. And then we get the Mundaka Upanishad. On the same tree, it'll explain the symbolism of it, is Purusha, the individual, the soul, remains sunk. So the lower bird is us, is the jiva. Remains sunk in grief and bewildered by his own lack of power, impotence, anisha. But when he sees the other, the Lord, so the upper bird will be God dwelling within, and the lower one will be the jiva. Very dualistic, huh? It sounds so far. Sees the other, the Lord, who is perfectly contented and knows his glory, then he becomes free from sorrow. So this verse lends itself very easily to a dualistic type of interpretation, but if we think very deeply about it, we can see how this dualism is only an apparent separation, apparent distinction, and that ultimately these two friends who are so close to each other have the same name, or inseparable friends, that they're really one. There's only one. So we'll see both ways that this can be interpreted. So we have the Jivatman and Paramatman. We have the individual soul who's busy enjoying life and alternately enjoying and suffering. And the other bird, the higher bird, who is just watching and with complete contentment and peace, very serene, not getting involved in anything. So these are also two different ideals that we have, and two different types of different ways of living in this world. So we start out with this idea, and everything else we'll get, Shankaracharya's commentary, Swamiji's parable, will be woven out of this. So we have this picture. Where do we picture the birds? This idea, the one is on a lower limb and the other's at the top of the tree. Swamiji provides that for us. We're simply told that they're on the same tree. So we have to try to enter into the parable as Swamiji will weave this parable. So we start to get an understanding that in spiritual life, it's not simply having a different view and a different understanding. This lower bird will undergo some type of transformation. And there's separation up to the very end until there's oneness. So as the bird will go from higher limb to higher limb to higher limb, it'll start to develop vairagya, it'll start to develop dispassion and everything until it'll get to the top. Now at the top, does it enter into oneness with the God, or does it realize identity? These are all the different types of interpretations that are possible with this verse. The dualist will always like to maintain some reality to the jiva, so the lower bird. So their idea, if we take this thing going higher and higher, that they'll enter into a state of union. The non-dualists will always have this idea that there's a false separation, and that here and now there's only this type of oneness. This is that Maya that covers everything, that doesn't allow us to see the real nature of the self. So we have a couple of different models, we can say, for the dualists, and that means qualified non-dualists also. For them, there's a certain reality to or substance to the individual soul that will remain, but it can really be a type of oneness or sameness, at least. If we take two different examples. If we take the example of several glasses of water. Now, the water inside can be the same as the water of the ocean water. You can even take it and cover it up and put it underneath, and there's only water. But if you move it, the water that's inside will go along with it. It has some reality to it. Even if you take the example of air. If we have a glass, and there's no liquid in it, there's air. If we move it, at least the air molecules will move along with it. The Advaitic illustration is pure space. If we think of nothing inside, pure space, does that pure space, is it confined within the glass? Does it move when we move the glass? The glass moves within space. Because there's nothing to it. It's pure, it's empty. It's perfectly empty. So this is the Advaitic idea. And the space inside the jar, the space outside the jar are exactly the same. The water inside the container and the water outside are identical as far as water goes, but they're separate. We can take it out and drink that water and everything. So anyhow, these are the two different types of illustrations that are used to explain these two different positions. Now, which one is right and which one is wrong? This is not the type of question that Sri Ramakrishna liked. His point of view was always pick one or the other that appeals to you. When you get to the roof, then you'll understand. And even then, it'll be beyond any of these conceptions. So don't worry too much about these things. He wasn't a philosopher like the Acharyas were philosophers. He had a different point of view for all of this. So these two birds, they go by the same name. Each one will claim to be I, will be claimed to be the real self. And at the same time, they're inseparable friends. The Sakhi, the inseparable friends. Why? Because wherever the mind goes, the witness has to be there to observe. We can't escape that. Whatever we do, that witnessing, however far the mind will wander, there's a witness will be there to observe. They go hand in hand. You can't take one and eliminate it from the other. Even that nirvikalpa samadhi state, the witness will be there. In fact, that's all that will be there at that time. But anyhow, so what causes the distinction between these two birds? Now, Sri Ramakrishna gives another nice illustration. Really, there's only oneness. But the stick of ego lies in between on the surface of the water and gives this feeling of separation. So Sri Ramakrishna, he liked all of these different ways of looking at it. Ultimately, we can say that if he felt this ego to be something superficial, just on the surface, that he accepted this idea of oneness. But he accepted the reality that this ego sense doesn't leave, and we have to deal with it, and we have to work through it. So I've mentioned this before, a very nice statement that Swami Paramishananji made, that Sri Ramakrishna was an Advaitavadan and Advaitakaran, that he was a practical person in spiritual life. We start out as dualists because we feel separate, But philosophically, if we want to go there, philosophically, ultimately everything ends in oneness. So this is how we can kind of look at both of these examples, that two birds as being separate and good friends, and this other idea that there's only one, ultimately only one. We can see how both of these can be very helpful to us in spiritual life. But the view that we seem to get from the verse and the explanation is that Ishvara, the Lord, dwells within the heart. That I'm there and God is there. And that Ishvara can be the Antaryamin, can be the controller. We have a famous verse, verse 61 in the 18th chapter of Gita, that not only is God there, He's making us go around in circles, as if mounted on a machine. So we have this idea that this divine presence is within the heart. I'm also there. Sri Ramakrishna, he would say sometimes, when I look deep within, what do I find? I find two. I see mother is there and the child is there. At other times I look in, I see mother alone is there. Then, because the sense of I, this ego, completely disappears. So both are true. Which one is absolutely true? Absolutely true means beyond everything, beyond all this conception. It means that experience. Now, if we take this idea, this self is like a friend. The two birds are friends. This is a very beautiful way of looking at that divine presence within. Normally, God dwelling within, there'll be a great sense of awe and worshipful feeling. Sometimes we like this mood of Sri Ramakrishna, that we feel the presence of mother within. We don't hear much about this Sakhya Bhava. To look upon God as a friend. That we read a very nice about a nice incident that took place when Swamiji came back to Belur Math. I don't remember first trip or second trip, but one day he said he wanted to do the worship, and at the time of the food offering, generally other people leave, so it'll just be him there. But they heard him say to Sri Ramakrishna, "Come, my friend, come sit, have your meal." Now, who can say that? Only Swamiji could say that, to look upon Sri Ramakrishna as his friend. But this idea that the self within is our best friend, it's an unusual idea. Swamiji liked this idea. There's a letter that he wrote to Mrs. Bull, speaking of the Atman as his friend, he says, "My stay, my guide in life, my refuge, my friend, my teacher, my God, the real self. Thou will never leave me, never, I know it for sure." Now this is when he's in a somewhat dualistic mood. How do I think of the self as my friend? I am that self. Because that stick of ego is there. And then that divine presence is within, and it can be our eternal companion, our eternal friend, to feel the divine presence within. It's not the mood that everybody can have. Swamiji had that idea. So, to get back to the verse, now we start to understand that the tree stands for this body. And the body, we can say, is not just the physical body, but mental. This is subtle body, the causal body, the mind also, that they cling to it. Now, how is it that these two birds are clinging to the tree? The lower one we can understand through desire, through attachment, through the desire for enjoyment, through false identification, and clinging again for the higher bird is only because this higher bird is kind of stuck as the witness. Can't just fly away. Will always be there. But otherwise free. Completely free, unattached, not affected. The lower bird is happy or sad. The higher bird is simply observing and watching. There's no reverberation. There's no real echo effect or anything. What happens to the lower bird for the higher bird? So he has no choice but to be the witness Whatever lower bird is doing or thinking is observed by the higher bird, by the witness within. So they're both on the same tree. As I said before, there's no mention that one is on a lower branch, one is on a higher branch. This will all come in Swamiji's parable, that we can imagine these different branches, if we want to use our own imagination, as different levels, even Kundalini. So now if we're the lower bird, Sri Ramakrishna says lower bird, that the self generally will be in the 3 lower branches, the Kundalini. And as we progress in spiritual life, we go higher and higher and higher. But Shiva is always at the top. So the Shakti has to make that path from the lower branches up to the higher branches. This is the image that we get from a description of samadhi that Sri Ramakrishna heard from one wandering sadhu. If you remember, in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, one sadhu came from Rishikesh and said to Sri Ramakrishna that there are 5 different types of samadhi. And different things, like a monkey jumping from one branch to another. One was a bird hopping from limb to limb to limb. So he said, like a bird hopping from one branch to another, the Mahavayu, the great wind or great energy, goes up in the tree of the body, now to this branch and now to that. One feels the rising of the great energy as though it were the movement of a bird. So this sadhu, he said to Sri Ramakrishna, he must have been there for some time and observed him. He said, I find all five different types of this. One like a monkey, one like a fish, one like an ant, one like a snake, and the last one like a bird. Or we can think of these different branches and levels like the different steps that we climb that will correspond to the gunas. That the lower ones are very tamasic, we get a little higher, rajasic, and we try to get to the very sattvic types of enjoyments, because a lot of this has to do with the fruit that we eat. So the very tamasic will be the ones that lead to the stagnation and death. This is tamas, that we just don't want to do anything. The rajasic type of fruits that we eat will be exciting, but will suffer at the end after that. The sattvic ones are the ones that take a little while to get used to. The Gita says in the beginning it tastes like poison, and at the end like nectar. So this is the way that this lower bird seems to be traveling higher and higher. Some transformation has to take place within us, and the things that we do and the things that we enjoy and what brings us some type of contentment in life. So we see these 2 birds are very different. The lower bird is doing all of these things, jumping about, eating the fruits and everything. A higher bird is simply watching. The verse simply says that swadu, that somehow it's flavorful. But Swamiji emphasizes this idea that some are sweet and some are bitter. And this, of course, is very helpful for us because experience in life, we have both sweet experiences and bitter experiences. And for Swamiji, we learn more from these bitter experiences. So let me finally read we'll get another one also, one of the ways in which Swamiji explains this verse. He says, upon the same tree there are 2 birds, one on the top, the other below. So this is his interpretation. We don't get that from the Upanishad. The one on the top is calm, silent, and majestic, immersed in his own glory. The one on the lower branches, eating sweet and bitter fruit by turns, hopping from branch to branch, is becoming happy and miserable by turns. After a time, the lower bird eats an exceptionally bitter fruit and gets disgusted, and looks up and sees the other bird, that wondrous one of golden plumage, who eats neither sweet nor bitter fruit, who is neither happy nor miserable, but calm, self-centered, and sees nothing beyond his self. The lower bird longs for this condition, but soon forgets it. So this is our condition. And again begins to eat the fruits. In a little while he eats another exceptionally bitter fruit, which makes him feel miserable. and he again looks up and tries to get nearer to the upper bird. Once more he forgets, and after a time he looks up, and so on he goes again and again until he comes very near to the beautiful bird and sees the reflection of light from his plumage playing around his own body. This is how we'll get to this Advaitic notion. It's beautiful how Swamiji does this. Playing around his own body, and he feels it change and seems to melt away. Still nearer he comes, and everything about him melts away, and at last he understands this wonderful change. The lower bird was, as it were, only the substantial-looking shadow, the reflection of the higher. He himself was, in essence, the upper bird all the time. So we get this two teachings here, really. This idea that we fail to see our own real nature. We're too involved, and the mind is going outward with enjoyment and everything. But we also get this idea that there's gradual transformation that has to take place. That as we higher and get higher and higher and higher, the sense of individuality, sense of separation, this feeling of strong ego feeling and individuality, this starts to melt away. Swamiji used to tease people in the West. He said, "You people, you're so enamored with your individuality." He would stretch the whole thing out like that. He said, "Don't you know you're not individuals now? When you know your true nature, then that's a real individuality. That means the real self-identity." So we get this great teaching about the role of suffering in life. That how this is one of the greatest teachers that we have, and if it weren't for that suffering, we would go about without questioning anything. Now, sometimes too much of enjoyment, good things, that also can be a little bit cloying sometimes, or it leads to some type of boredom, and we ask, is there anything more? But for most people, it's the hard knocks that we get in life that are most valuable to us. Swamiji wrote a beautiful poem called Angels Unaware. And in one of them, he uses this phrase, "Oh, blessed misery," that because it makes us question, is this all there is? Anything else in life that we only here to enjoy and suffer? So this is the greatest teacher for us. Now, second verse. We'll go a little bit further in explaining who these two birds are. And it'll explain this symbolism. Here, we get very specifically mentioned that the first bird is the individual soul, Purusha. Now, we find this Purusha sometimes used for the individual soul, sometimes for the Supreme Soul. It means person. It means, it's a very kind of general term. So here it means the individual soul, and the second bird is identified as Isha. This is our Ishvara, as the Lord. We may think of the Ishvara primarily as the creator, that which projects this whole universe. But in Gita and other texts, the Ishvara is found dwelling within the heart also. So this ground idea and projection idea, but also dwelling within as the higher self, we may say. The first bird is described as Nimagnaha, drowned, sunk in despair, caught in this endless round of enjoyment and pleasant things and unpleasant things, and then trying to forget the bad things and looking for good things again. This round of sweet and bitter fruit that we go through, and not able to get out of this cycle. Now, why is this so? Why do we suffer, really? What's the reason? We get two answers. One is anisha. We feel helpless. We don't know who to turn to. Either we feel that we have no power, or we feel there's no God to help us. That it can be overwhelming sometimes. Many people know this, and depression can come from this feeling that how do we get out? We feel stuck. So this is one thing. The other is muhyamana, that we don't know who we are, we're deluded. That we think we're small individual creatures, that we're destined to just struggle and go along in life and then die, and there's nothing more. So these are the two main things that are mentioned in this verse. We don't know our real nature as perfect and free and pure and joyful. And it's only because we see these Sri Ramakrishna, that we see these great souls, that we understand that joy is the essence of life, if we can get rid of all these other things that are preventing it from us. So, what is the solution that's given here? The solution that we find is not the lower bird jumping up and going higher and higher and higher. It's simply observing. Jushtam yada pashyati, when it sees that upper bird. So remember that the imagery is going to sound very dualistic here. That's fine. And who knows if it's meant that way. But anyhow, this is the way it's being interpreted. Simply has to see the higher bird to understand the joy and majesty that comes from dispassion. How peaceful and serene that higher bird is, and to understand that this is the way to transcend this suffering in life, to not get too involved, too attached to things, and to really stand a little bit aside and observe, to be the witness of everything, and to feel the freedom that comes from that. So this lower bird, just by seeing, it's not just that it sees, but it'll learn that lesson, and this transformation can take place. And it can start to feel that, yes, I too should be the witness, that I want to be like that bird. We do this when we see these great souls. You remember the story of Buddha when he went out of the palace for the fourth time. He sees this young sadhu looking so joyful and peaceful. He says, I want to be like him. So this lower bird says, I want to be like that upper bird. And just by seeing. So this vision of the Lord, Ishvara, removes all grief, vita shokaha. Now, as I say, it can't simply be that vision. That vision has to be something that's transforming. So if we have that understanding, that vision, it can be the higher bird, it can be a great soul, that can have that transforming effect for us. So as I say, it seems awfully dualistic, this interpretation. Not just the first verse, but the interpretation that the Mundaka Upanishad gives after that. So, is it a stretch for Swamiji to say, oh, well, one bird is actually at the top, and that this lower bird doesn't really exist? Is it his own imagination? Is he going too far? That these rishis came up with this Dvasuparna. These are not to be taken lightly. My answer is that Swamiji was also a rishi. In that song we even heard, Sri Ramakrishna said that he came from one of the seven rishis, or that he was Nara, Narayana, that Swamiji had every right to interpret it any way he wanted to. It was his own direct experience, and a very beautiful interpretation that he gives. So whether this was the intention of the Upanishadic authors, whoever they were, or how these things came to us, that's a different question. But his interpretation, for me, is not only 100% legitimate, but so helpful and beautiful that we really don't have to ask that type of question. So Swamiji was no less a rishi than these ancient rishis, and it's based on his own experience. And also, Shankaracharya gives a similar interpretation. I want to read from Shankaracharya's commentary. This is on the second of those two verses. When he sees the Lord, Isha, who is transcendent, free from hunger, thirst, sorrow, delusion, decay, and death, the Lord of the whole universe, he thinks, I am this one. So he's going to go straight to this idea of oneness. The lower bird sees the other bird and says, I am this one. He says, I am this one who is the self of all, the same in all, and existing in every being. I am not the other illusory self, the lower bird, limited by false superimpositions, conjured up by ignorance. And when he sees his glory and splendor in the form of the universe, he thinks, this glory is indeed mine. I who am the Supreme Lord, Parameshwara. Then he becomes free from grief. He becomes saved from the ocean of sorrow. That is to say, he reaches the end of all desires. Now there's a third verse that is really the second of the two kind of commentaries on this that we find in Mundaka Upanishad. And this also clarifies things a little bit, explaining the nature of the experience of this lower bird. So this verse says, Yada pasya pashyade urukma varnam karataram isham purusham brahma yonim tada vidwan punya pape vidhuya niranjana paramam samyam upayati. When he sees the lower bird, when the seer, that means the lower bird, when the lower bird, individual soul, beholds the Lord, who is of the complexion of gold, so light, radiant light, we can say, he is the karta, he is the master. So this is that idea of antaryaman, the Ishvara dwelling within, the master, the purusha, now this means the supreme purusha, and the womb or source of Brahma, the creator. Then the wise one, so now the lower bird is going to be the wise one and illumined soul. The wise one or illumined soul becomes perfectly free of both virtue and vice, that is good and bad karma, and becomes stainless and attains to the state of perfect sameness, samya. Now this will be a very critical idea. What does this samya mean? Now, we can say that I would say there are three different possible interpretations. One, that the lower bird will become like the upper bird. We're separate. I see that God dwells within as the witness, completely unattached, completely free, completely content, not seeking anything. I'll also be like that. There's a very beautiful way of interpreting this. That we can say that, yes, this is the nature of the ultimate reality, to have perfect contentment and peace and not run after all the desires. I'll also be like that. Forget about the metaphysics. Am I one with that or not? Forget about that. I want to be like that. So this idea of samya, this is one idea. Then this idea of samya is perfect equilibrium, that I won't be upset by this or by that, and also seeing the same in all the other beings. This is also samya. And the third one is identity oneness, merging, that he attains that oneness, the lower bird with the upper bird. In Swamiji's way of understanding it, there's no lower bird to really attain to oneness, but from this lower point of view, we can say that we become merged and we realize that that's our true identity. So we have this very interesting idea that we're looking at ourselves and not recognizing it. That even if we can see the Lord dwelling within the heart, that we think that this is something separate from us. Have you ever had the experience of going to one of these restaurants that one whole wall is mirror? Yeah. I remember one time this happened to me, that I really got fooled, because it looks like a room that's double the size of that room, and that there are the same number of tables and chairs and everything on the other side that they are on this one side. But if you start walking closer, you start to say, oh, there's somebody over there who looks like me, and he keeps getting closer and closer. Then you finally get there and say, oh, it was me the whole time. It was just a reflection. So this is that idea that at every step of the way, we see this other person, and not to the very end we realize, oh, just a reflection. I was that person all along. So this is that idea of sameness that we get. So as I say, we have two ways of looking at this verse. Each one is beautiful. God dwells within the heart. I have a relationship with God. I cling to God. I try to emulate. The divine presence within is pure and perfect. I want to be pure and perfect myself. It's beautiful. There's nothing wrong with this. And then this other point of view, that is my real self. This is not any external God dwelling within. This is my own higher self. So I am going to stop by reading a second explanation that Swamiji gives. There were several, as I say. This one It's from a lecture he gave, The Ideal of a Universal Religion. The upper bird is God, the Lord of the universe, and the lower bird is the human soul, eating the sweet and bitter fruits of this world. Now and then comes a heavy blow to the soul. For a time, he stops the eating and goes towards the unknown God, and a flood of light comes. He thinks that this world is a vain show. Yet again, the senses drag him down, and he begins, as before, to eat the sweet and bitter fruits of the world. Again, an exceptionally hard blow comes. His heart becomes open again to divine light. Thus gradually he approaches God, and as he gets nearer and nearer, he finds his old self melting away. When he has come near enough, he sees that he is no other than God, and he exclaims, "He whom I have described to you as the life of this universe, as present in the atom and in suns and moons, he is the basis of our own life, the soul of our own soul. Nay, thou art that." This is what the Jnana Yoga teaches. It tells man that he is essentially divine. It shows to mankind the real unity of being, and that each one of us is the Lord God himself, manifested on earth. All of us, from the lowest worm that crawls under our feet to the highest beings to whom we look up with wonder and awe, all are manifestations of the same Lord. Let us take a few minutes and sit in silence.